So I just want to note here that in the textbook, it goes through another example, and it walks through both FIFO and weighted average for this chai tea box. So if you want to look at another example or another breakdown, you can look through these pages on the textbook. But I'm not going to go through them in the video. So we're going to move on to comparing the effects of FIFO and moving weighted average cost. So when we use the two different costs, how does that impact our cost of goods sold and our ending inventory? So I talked about this in the last example video for Elmo's music. We discussed that in that case, the costs were decreasing each time we had a purchase. And when that happened, it resulted that FIFO ended up with a higher unit or a higher cost of goods sold, and weighted average had the lower cost of goods sold. And FIFO had a lower ending inventory, whereas weighted average had the higher ending inventory. And just really quickly to note that these two things will always move in the opposite direction. So our cost of goods available for sale that we discussed in chapter 5. So at some point in the year, you had your opening plus all of your purchases, and you got to your cost of goods available for sale. Now that is broken out into two parts, either your cost of goods sold or what's still left in ending inventory. So when one of the systems has a higher cost of goods sold, it will mean it has a lower ending inventory or compared to the other method. So here we had the lower cost of goods sold, which meant more left in ending inventory. Okay, so Elmo's music, the costs were decreasing. Weighted average cost had the lower cost of goods sold. And as I said, that will always be the case when purchase costs are decreasing. So if costs are decreasing, FIFO will always produce a higher cost of goods sold. And that's because we're moving out the most expensive items first. So the first items that we purchased were a higher value. We moved them out of inventory into cost of goods sold first. Therefore, we've got the higher cost of goods sold. When you have a higher cost of goods sold, as we see here, that means we're taking away more from the sales revenue. So we also have the lower gross margin. So a higher cost of goods sold results in a lower gross margin. And from that gross margin, we would take away the operating expenses, which would be the same under both systems. Therefore, we're left with a lower net income. And since we moved out the higher value, because the first ones we purchased were more expensive, we moved out those higher value items when we sold them, and therefore we're left with the least expensive or the lower cost in our ending inventory. Because of that, FIFO will also have the lower ending inventory. Now the opposite is true when we looked at the weighted average. So since each purchase we had a lower or a decreased purchase cost, it drove down the unit cost that we calculated in our weighted average unit cost. So we recalculated it after each purchase and it came down, and then we used that lower unit cost when we made the sales. And as a result, we had lower cost of goods sold because our unit cost we were using was going down. A lower cost of goods sold means we're subtracting less from sales and we get a higher gross margin, take away operating expenses, and we're left with a higher net income. But we also have this higher value left in our ending inventory under weighted average. Okay, so that's when costs are decreasing. This example that the textbook went through, we can see here that unit costs are now going up instead. So every time we have a new purchase, the unit cost was increasing. And the textbook shows us this information related to that example. So we know the revenue is the same under both, but here under FIFO, we now have a lower cost of goods sold than we do under the weighted average. And that's because under FIFO, the first ones in are these lower cost. So the $10, then $11, then $12. So the first in are the lower amount, and those are getting moved out into cost of goods sold first. So therefore, we have a lower cost of goods sold. And we know that when we have a lower cost of goods sold, we're taking away less from our sales, and therefore we have the higher gross margin. If we have a higher gross margin, we also have a higher net income. And when it comes to our ending inventory, we're left in inventory with the higher costing items. So therefore, we have a higher ending inventory under FIFO when costs are increasing. For weighted average, it's going to be the opposite when costs are increasing. So now, each time we purchased something and we're calculating a new unit cost, it's getting driven up by the increasing unit prices from those purchases. So when we sell something, we now use that higher unit cost, so it results in a higher cost of goods sold, which then leads to a lower gross margin and a lower net income. And since our cost of goods sold was higher, we also have lower ending inventory in the weighted average. So when it's increasing, FIFO is where we look better because we have lower cost of goods sold and a higher net income and higher ending inventory on our balance sheet as well. Weighted average, we look worse when things are increasing because we've got this lower net income and lower ending inventory. When costs are decreasing, weighted average is the one that looks better with the higher income, higher net or higher ending inventory, and we look worse under FIFO because we've got lower net income and lower ending inventory. So this is kind of a summary slide here. So we know that we have seen in a couple examples there, the costing method create different financial results. Most companies want to look the best that they can, and therefore they prefer higher income so that they can either get loans from the bank, maybe attract new investors to purchase shares. So they want that higher income. Therefore, if we are in an environment of increasing prices, companies are likely to choose which method? Well, we saw here when prices were increasing, FIFO was the better method. So they would likely choose the FIFO method. In environments of decreasing purchase costs, companies will likely choose the weighted average. Because we saw from Elmo's music, when prices were decreasing, they looked better under the weighted average method. So typically, we see that prices increase, purchase costs go up. So just with inflation and the way life goes, as time goes on, prices go up. So that's more common. But there is environments where prices decrease. And technology is a good example of that. So if we think about an iPhone, every time a new model comes out, the older phones now have a lower value. So if a retail store is looking to sell them, they could probably purchase them for less. And you as a customer would likely purchase them for less as well. Okay, so that is just a comparison, and it's good to know which type would create a higher or a better income when things are increasing versus decreasing.